Giving 10% can become a god itself. It can become an idol that we believe brings us financial blessings or keeps us at a financial status that isn't worse. And the problem with that is that it makes the act of giving 10% the God that you turn to for financial blessings instead of seeing God and his character and his goodness as the God who gives you blessings. Satan doesn't have a problem with you giving religiously 10% to church if you have turned that 10% into a God that you worship. Welcome to the My Two Cents podcast, where we explore the financial things that many of us never learned in church. Every week, we'll dive into what Scripture says about work, saving, investing, debt, generosity, stewardship, and everything in between. Not to build bigger bank accounts, but to build hearts that trust God more fully. I'm Sarah Grown, and these are My Two Cents. We are back, and I am starting a whole new series called the MythBusters series. My kids, especially my oldest, absolutely loves MythBusters. Hang on a second. Not totally set up here. Forgot to turn on my light. There we go. Yeah, that's better. Okay, so we're doing a whole MythBuster series. I think I have 7 of them, but my very first one, we're going to talk about a somewhat controversial subject, as you can obviously tell in the heading, and that is the subject of tithing. So this might be a little longer episode, but I know there's so many of you that are really interested in tithing, whether you think you know for sure what's true, maybe you're wondering, no matter where you are, I'm going to give you a really holistic view of tithing. A lot of times when the topic of tithing is spoken about, whether it's in the church or by another influencer, it's talked about in a way that is speaking to a specific person. And maybe that person is someone who has always tithed religiously, or it's that person who really doesn't tithe or doesn't give a full 10% to their local church. And that's really what I mean when I'm saying tithe. That's one of the tricky parts about talking about this, is it can mean different things to different people. And so that's one of the reasons why this is a hot topic, is because there's just a lot of misunderstanding because no one really defines terms. So needless to say, what I want to do is just not speak to one or the other, just speak holistically about it and figure out whether it's plausible, whether it's busted, or whether it's confirmed as to whether tithing brings financial blessings. So the first thing that MythBusters do when they look at a myth is they tell you where it comes from, right? Generally, they'll say at the beginning of their episode, this is where we heard this myth from. This is where it came from. We saw it in a movie. We read in a newspaper article that this happened, that this is true. And so that's where the source comes from. So that's what we're going to do first. And then we'll test it and see if it's true in different situations, different variables. And then we will come towards the end to find our conclusion. Now, right off the bat, I want to tell you just practically what I have experienced with tithing. I have given 10% of my paycheck since my very first paycheck. Now, I have not always given 10% to my local church, but I've always given generally more than 10%, but given as a whole of our income, 10% or more. There may be sometimes where it fell slightly below 10%. It's always been right around there. I don't know that I can say positively, like I have seen financial blessings come from that. And with that in mind, we're going to talk about how it can actually take this and look at what Scripture says. So like we talked about in this other episode, I'll link it here so you can go watch this other episode. A few episodes ago, we talked about how to interpret the Bible faithfully, how we can't read the Bible through our experiences. We have to read our experiences through the Bible. I talked about how to look at context correctly and all that kind of stuff. That could be really helpful to watch before. If you haven't listened to that episode or watched that episode, go back to the episode, How to Read the Bible, and listen to that one first. But the reason that this myth exists is primarily because of, one, people's experiences. We hear people's stories about how they felt convicted to start giving 10% to their church. they started giving 10% to their church, and miraculously, there was enough at the end of the month. Miraculously, they got a raise. Miraculously, a check ended up coming in the mail. Miraculously, their business actually took off. Miraculously, just tons and tons of different, very different stories that all are pointing to the same thing, that when you give 10% to your local church, there seems to be a blessing that follows that. And I honestly, as a financial coach that works in Christian finance, I see this all the time, and I don't doubt it for a second. I know God's kindness. And so those stories are real. I'm not negating those stories at all. I'm just putting them in a very logical place, because like a MythBuster, we have to this is where the myth comes from. I'm just putting it in a very logical place. The second place that this comes from is verses like Malachi 3:10 in the Bible. So once again, I'm just trying to put these in a logical place. I'm just trying to put them where they belong so that we can test the myth fully. Okay. So Malachi 3:10 is this verse about how the Lord, he says, test me, bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, and see if I won't open the floodgates of heaven and keep the locusts from devouring your crops. All these kind of things. God says that. And that sounds very convincing, that if we bring our tithe, our 10% to our local church, that God will protect our financial investments. He will make our financial endeavors successful. He will just bless us materially, because that's very much what Malachi 3:10 says. Okay, so let's look at those two. We know that's where it comes from, so we need to separate those out and test the myth. And so one of the things that we want to test the myth is saying, does it always happen? Is this something we can really depend on? Because if it doesn't always happen, then we need to back up and see if those sources that we believed, the stories we've heard and the verses we've read, what are those saying if it's not true that it always happens? And so I'm going to look for evidence of places where giving 10% to church didn't bring financial blessings. And that's really, just so you know, that's what I'm looking at. It's not blessings as in God's peace, God's presence, God's closeness. There are so many blessings in life that are not equated to financial, material type things. But so often this specific thing, giving 10% to the local church, is said to be tied very specifically to material financial blessings and abundance. And so that is what I mean when I'm talking about blessings. So is there any stories of people who gave faithfully 10% to church, to their local church, and didn't see financial blessings? And I have friends who most certainly would nod their head yes and say, I trusted the Lord wholly. I gave more than the 10% faithfully to church, just trusting in the Lord that he would provide. And we lost everything. We lost our car. We lost our house. We were depending on the Lord for a miracle and trusting him as our provider, and we lost everything. That can be really damaging. But also on top of that, not just going off of one friend's story, the bankruptcy laws that were created, when were they created? It doesn't really matter. I'm not giving you a history lesson here. When the bankruptcy laws were created, a few years later, they had to add a clause to the bankruptcy laws that allowed people to give 10% to their religious organizations. The reason that they did this was not because the government is so religious. The reason they did this is because the people who were in bankruptcy so faithfully believed they needed to be tithing that even while they were in bankruptcy, losing everything, not paying back their creditors, they believed they needed to continue to still give 10% to their local church, to the extent that the government realized they needed to allow that because of how persistently these people who were in bankruptcy wanted to give to their local church. So that says a lot. The fact that the government even made a law that allowed that says a lot about the fact that these people were tithing faithfully. They were giving faithfully to their local church, and they ended up in bankruptcy. Enough times, enough people that this became a thing where the government decided, all right, I guess we need to add a clause to our bankruptcy laws that allows people to continue to give to God. So that alone says, okay, if tithing brings financial blessing and financial favor, why were these people who were so faithful in tithing declaring bankruptcy? There's a lot of different reasons, but I'm just pointing out that there is places where it doesn't seem to be true. And so we need to look at that as a whole. Now, let's look at Malachi. This is actually the easy part because, like I said, if you look at the Bible and don't cherry pick verses, a lot of stuff becomes a lot clearer. So Malachi 3:10 is one of the minor prophets. It is written to the Israelite nation through the prophet Malachi, who is delivering a message to the Israelites from the Lord. Now, during this time, the Israelites were under the Mosaic covenant. Many people call this the Old Covenant. There's lots of covenants. The Mosaic covenant is just one of them, and it is a conditional covenant. It's one of the covenants that we are no longer under now that we are under the New Covenant. That's why it's called Old Covenant, New Covenant. There's also other ones, the Abrahamic covenant, the Noahic covenant, the Davidic covenant. But the Mosaic covenant, very specifically, was this conditional covenant that the Israelites agreed to with the Lord. All these laws were laid out, and the people said, yes, we agree. We're going to do that. And the Lord said, all right, we're in this covenant together. We have both agreed. And the agreement was that if the Israelites stuck to that law and did the things that they agreed in the covenant to do, the Lord would bless them. And the blessings are listed in Deuteronomy 28. You can go and read them for yourself. Now, the blessings and curses were very specific. If they followed, God would do his part and he would bless them. If they did not follow, God would still be faithful to the covenant and do the curses. There was a covenant. They agreed to the blessings and curses that would happen if they did and did not follow the law that they were given. And so when the book of Malachi was written, they were under this Mosaic covenant. Now, when God says, test me, bring in the whole tithe, the tithing was actually not the only thing that they were not doing correctly. We see earlier in Malachi that they were bringing their leftovers to God. They were bringing the spotted, blemished, broken lambs as sacrifices. They were not honoring their marriage. There was just a lot of not good stuff. They were really trying to worship God and other things instead of God wholeheartedly. And so they were halfway doing what they should have been wholeheartedly doing. And it was leading them to this place where they just weren't following God's laws. And of course, that was one of the things that they were not doing also, was not bringing in their tithe that they had agreed to in that law to bring into the storehouses. And so when God says, test me and see if I won't open the floodgates if you bring that back into the storehouse, what he's not saying is specifically tithing is the thing that unlocks the abundance of God. What he is saying is returning to the laws of the covenant is what is going to bring the blessings that are already there for you. When he's saying, test me, what he's saying is you have already seen that I am faithful in the curses. Now turn around, do the thing that I have told you to do. Come back to the law. And I think it's so interesting that he could have said, bring pure lambs. He could have said, honor your marriages. But he pointed his finger at bringing the first tenth of their produce into the storehouse as if he knew exactly what was actually holding their hearts from him. He knew that was the idol they needed to give up, and so he pointed to it. And that is so often true of us, and I think that's a beautiful thing to find from Malachi 3:10. But I hope you're catching on to what I'm saying. What we cannot take out of is that we can test the Lord to see if he will bless us by bringing 10% to our local church, because that's not what he's saying in Malachi 3:10. What he is saying is, I'm faithful to my covenant. this is the covenant that I have given you. It's a covenant of blessing and it's a covenant of curses. And so test me and see if I am not so faithful and so loving that if you turn back to me, that I will bless you in the ways I promised I already would. And so that is the nuance you absolutely need to see with Malachi 3:10. It is so often taken out of context. It is so often used to promote the prosperity gospel unknowingly because it feels like it's so clear and straightforward. And so that really undoes that whole idea around Malachi 3 and tithing, specifically giving 10% to our local church, being some sort of promise from the Lord that we will get blessings. Okay, with that all said, now we need to keep going a little farther because I really do believe that in many ways, giving 10% of our income does bring so much goodness, but not necessarily guaranteed material blessings. To take a little break there and help my kid with math. Where was I? So we have looked at people's experiences. We know that people have experienced blessings for sure. We know that people have experienced loss. And I think even adding to that experience, we often think about this in a westernized culture. And when you look at people from outside of our westernized first world country, you really do see pretty clearly that they're prepared to lose everything, especially not just financially, but their lives as well. And so often I feel like we forget about that. And as Christians as a whole, we need to be thinking not just, is this true of us in westernized America, but is this true of Christians as a whole universally? Because the Bible is true for them as well. What God promises to us, he promises to them. And so we always need to keep them in mind when we are speaking about what is true. Okay, so we've looked at experiences. We've looked at Malachi 3:10. I'm going to include in the show notes my entire blog that I wrote. I have a 5-part blog series that I'm happy to send you that really goes into all the nitty-gritty details of tithing. I don't know that I will ever do a podcast episode about this because there's just so many nitty-gritty details about tithing, but I do believe that there's a few of you out there that are likely very curious about it, and so I'll include that link below. You can go click that and get those blog articles. And just so you know, tithing, whether or not Christians are required to tithe, is actually a really ancient, hot topic. It has been something that fathers in the early church have disagreed on. It is something that some of the best theologians still disagree on. And so remember that no matter whether someone, a preacher or a pastor, an author, and you agree or disagree with them as to whether Christians are required to tithe, to just extend them the charitable grace that they deserve, because it is not a top tier issue. It is not, is Jesus God? Was he born of a virgin? Did he die on a cross? Did he raise again? It is not like a top tier issue. It is a lower tier issue, which means that we really can have a lot of grace and charity towards people who disagree with us in this subject while still holding very strongly to the convictions that we have. Like I have really held strongly for years to the conviction I have as to what is true about tithing, and being charitable towards people who see it differently is not me saying I'm not confident in what I believe. You don't have to hand over confidence. You only have to hand over pride. And so hand over the pride to the Lord, give it to him. You can still hang on to your confidence and be charitable and kind to people who disagree with you on things, even if you feel like it's very important, which I do. Why I'm talking about this today. So keep that in mind as you continue to learn more about what the Bible says about tithing. I personally believe, I'm just going to tell you straight up, that I don't believe Christians under the new covenant are required to tithe. Now, with that said, before you come after me in the comments, I just want to tell you that I do believe there is something special about 10%. I don't know what it is. The only way that I can really explain it is I believe it's special because I don't think God tells his people to do things without a certain level of intentionality. And I don't know what that was with the Israelites, and I probably never will. But what I do know is that God told the Israelites to give a tenth to the Levites. He told them to set aside a tenth for the biblical feasts. He told them to give a tenth every 3 years, which he could have said give 3% every year. He could have said give 3% every year, but he said give a tenth every third year, your tenth. And there's different scholars will say this means different things, but needless to say, it's still a tenth. And then furthermore, we see Abraham giving 10%, a tenth of his war spoils to Melchizedek. And we see Jacob telling God that he would give him a tenth of all he owned if God did the things that he said he was going to do. Furthermore, we see that there was one of the 10 lepers that returned to Jesus to thank him, which is a tenth of them. There's a few theories as to what this tenth can symbolize or mean in biblical stories, but I don't know that any of them are true. And honestly, I don't really care. All I really do care about is the fact that God loved his people, the Israelites. He gave them their laws for their good, and he didn't choose 15%. He didn't choose 5%. He didn't choose 3%. He said a tenth 3 times. And so maybe there's something to that's for our good. Maybe not. Maybe I'll get to heaven and God will be like, that was really very specifically because of how much produce I knew that they were going to get. Maybe it has nothing to do with us today, but potentially it does help us or is good for us to some level. Maybe it's exactly what they needed to be giving of their income in order to keep their hands open from being stingy. Maybe there's some more psychology to it. So much of the Bible, science is just catching up to the psychology behind forgiveness and renewing your mind and extending grace towards people and just all these different things that they're like, oh, just now science and psychology is like, yeah, actually people literally live longer when they do this thing. And there is 100% studies around generosity doing that. They just have never nailed it down to exact 10%. So needless to say, I don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think there's something special about giving a tenth, which is why I still continue to give a tenth. And more than that, like when you really look at what the Israelites gave, they were giving about 23% because they had multiple tithes. And that's not even including the other gifts and offerings. In reality, when you look at what the Israelites gave, it was almost half of what their income was. One other note here about tithing is that people can often fall into 2 different ditches. One person can fall into the ditch of like, always give 10% to your local church no matter what. And the other ditch is people who are like, oh, I'm free to give what my heart desires. And when I feel like giving, I do give a little bit here and there if I have leftovers. Those are like your 2 different ditches. To the ditch with the leftovers, I would challenge you to lead your heart by giving. It says, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. That is directly pointing to the idea that when we give first, our heart becomes invested in what we've given to. And there is so much truth to that. And so if you are feeling like I just give when I feel cheerful, I would challenge that because you're made in the image of a generous God. And when you see God's incredible generous character, you realize that our generosity, even at its most, is puny compared to him. And we are supposed to be a little bit more like him. So I would challenge you to open your hand a little farther, to come to the Lord and ask him very specifically, how much do you want me to give? Not what do I feel like giving, but Lord, help me feel like giving more. Change my heart so that it is joyful for me to give more. Because to have a heart that's not joyful in giving is a heart that is still broken and still needs healing. And so I would take that to the Lord. Now, on the other side of the ditch, with always giving 10%, it can turn into a fear that if you were to give less than 10%, that your financial life would go worse. My favorite theologian that talks about tithing, he actually recommends that no one ever give 10%. Now, I don't come to that conclusion. Obviously, I've already talked about that. But the reason he says that is because of this ditch. And because Giving 10% can become a god itself. It can become an idol that we believe brings us financial blessings, or it even keeps us at a financial status that isn't worse. And the problem with that is that it makes the act of giving 10% the God that you turn to for financial blessings, instead of seeing God and his character and his goodness as the God who gives you blessings. So that is the danger in the 10%, always 10%, only 10% rut that you can get stuck on, is it becomes a God itself. And Satan doesn't have a problem with you giving religiously 10% to church if you have turned that 10% into a God that you worship. So I would challenge you to take that to the Lord. It's very possible that he wants you to continue giving 10%, but with a new heart. Or it's possible that he wants to challenge you to give a little less for the sake of bringing your heart back to your true provider, not the little g God of the tithe. There's just a little side note, little rabbit trail for you, but I think that's a really important thing to note about the different places people can be in with tithing. And most of you probably fall in the middle, somewhere in the middle. You'll probably gravitate more towards one or the other. But no matter what, no matter where you are with your giving journey with the Lord, with what you think about tithing, bring it to the Lord. Pray about it. Study it for yourself. If you want to hear from the Lord and what he has to say, get in your word. Get in the word. His voice sounds like the Bible. And so if you want to be able to recognize his voice, get in your Bible and be in it all the time. I could talk about this all day. If you sat me down with a cup of coffee, I could have a 2-hour conversation with you about tithing. But needless to say, what we really need to wrap up this episode, because it's starting to get long here, is, does it bring financial blessing? I think giving 10% to your local church does bring material blessings, but not on this side of eternity always. The Bible tells us that no matter what we do, that is good, that is for the Lord, that is towards his kingdom, even if we just give a little one a cold glass of water, we won't lose our reward in heaven. And I do not believe that our rewards in heaven are just a softer cloud to sit on. I believe that the other side of eternity is going to be full of all the goodness of God, which includes material things. It includes adventure. It includes safety. It includes abundance. It includes all the things that we find good in their purest form. We are told, we are promised, we can hold on to that hope with all certainty that on the other side of eternity, we will most certainly see that reward. On this side of eternity, it is plausible. That means that it's not a promise. It's not something we have the right to expect, but because we know our God, we know he is generous, we know he is kind, we know he is good, which means that he will say no when it is for our good. We know his character is trustworthy and that he loves to give his children good gifts and he loves to give us rewards. Even on this side of eternity, he loves to give us rewards. He can do that if he wants to. I've heard story after story of God doing that, and I don't think for a second that he doesn't. The only thing I think is like we don't have the right to expect it. We have the right to expect that God's goodness will look exactly what it wants to, which means we just be obedient and do what we feel that God is calling us to do, whether that be to give 10%, whether it be to give 5%, whether it be to step out and be like, I have no idea how I'm going to pay the bills, but I'm going to give $20 to someone in need today because I think they need it more than I do. No matter what step of faith it is, whatever step of trust or obedience that looks like, maybe it's giving 23%. I've heard of people who, once they learned the Israelites were giving closer to 23%, started giving 23%. And no matter what it looks like, we're just called to be obedient and to do faithfully with our finances in a way that honors God and the outcomes are really up to him. And we can trust him that whether we receive some sort of blessing or whether we don't, it's good because God is for us and he is for our good. And that is really a good place to sit your soul, is to be in a place where you can say, I will obey God, even if rewards never come my way, because he is worthy of all my obedience and all my honor and all my finances, because of who he is, not because of the rewards that he may or may not give me. And that's just the heart posture that I always want to leave people with, is his goodness is not dependent on whether we see blessings and rewards. But when we do see blessings, rewards, or whether it just be his sovereignty and him teaching us, or just his kindness, I don't think I did anything worth receiving them. I think he was just being so kind. And how often does he do that for us? He just adores us. And that is just a really good place to be. If you don't realize how much God adores you and how you have Christ who has covered you in his pureness. And that's just such a gift. I don't think I will ever get over realizing the depths of that gift. All right, so that really sums up where we're at. Plausible on this side of eternity, confirmed on the other side of eternity. I hope that really explains some stuff. If you still have questions, feel free to reach out. Like I said, I could sit down with a cup of coffee and talk about tithing for hours. I'll also include, for those of you who maybe are a little nerdier, not just my blog, but also a book that is written by a theologian that I really appreciated his work on tithing. He did such a thorough job diving in, not just into the arguments in this book, but he actually looked back into church history and really looked into every single angle that was possible. I just really appreciated his work. I thought he did a really good job. And that is a hefty read. It is a theological read, but if you are a nerd like me, maybe you'll appreciate it. So I'll include the link in the show notes as well. Okay, I think that it kind of wraps up our episode for today. See you next week.